Non-violent action, neither a passive acceptance of oppression nor a violent opposition to it. Non-violent action is an active commitment to utilizing non-violent means to resist violent forces in order to bring about change. It is a means of challenging problems of dictatorship, genocide, war, exploitation, and systems of oppression in society. So to start off, I'm going to introduce my media item. I have chosen this image from Gandhi's Salt March of 1930. This photo was taken from one of the most historically important events in the history of non-violent action and protest, and it represents far more than what meets the eye. One of, if not the most prominent figure in the history of peaceful protest was Gandhi, and Gene Sharp's theory, which I will be discussing throughout this video, draws largely on the inspiration and principles behind his thinking. The campaigns he led in South Africa and India were grounded by a commitment to non-violence and respect for other human beings, no matter what values divided them. He was focused on challenging structures of power through peaceful resistance in a time when India was rigidly divided by colour, class, sex, and religion. The pinnacle of Gandhi's success as a pioneer of social change was the Salt March of 1930, a 24-day protest march to the Arabian Sea in defiance of the British Salt Act that prohibited Indians from collecting or selling salt. It imposed a salt tax and held a monopoly on manufacturing. The act evolved into a symbol of resistance to British rule in India and built huge momentum. By the time he reached the ocean, he was leading a pack of tens of thousands of supporters. 600,000 people were arrested following the Salt March, including Gandhi himself, as they followed his lead in defying the British law by picking up natural salt from the mud. Despite this, his act was effective in promoting national awareness and forging a new discourse about issues that had not previously been discussed or challenged publicly. While non-violent protest existed long before Gandhi's time, this certainly marked a turning point in the history of its use. India's independence was not granted until 1947, but people were inspired by his efforts and began to realize the power it had to band people together and present a resisting force without turning to violence or war. Renowned theorist Gene Sharp, who, as I mentioned, was highly influenced by the example Gandhi led, contributed greatly to the theory on non-violent action, and his work is crucial to understanding the practices, dynamics, and possible outcomes of peaceful protest. He says the power in its technique is the ability it has to undermine or expose the weaknesses of a higher force by demonstrating opposition. It operates to undermine the opponent while helping the resistors to mobilize increased strength and support for their cause. The stability of a higher individual or group relies upon the cooperation of the population and the institutions of the society they rule. The source of their power is in the submission and obedience of their subjects, and if the subjects upset that order, the power will shift. As more people realize the injustices of the higher power, the more they support or join the protesters in their actions, and thus the more effective it will be in putting a stop to the mistreatment. Sharp situates 200 or so different methods of non-violent action into three main categories. The first is non-violent protest and persuasion. This kind of protest is used to bring a certain cause to the public's attention. This might include parades, pickets, posters, education forums, naked protest, or protest meetings. The second method he talks about is non-cooperation, meaning to remove oneself from cooperation or relations with a disagreeable activity or institution, a defiance of existing structures or relationships in society. This is the most broad category that Sharp outlines and might be carried out in the form of a strike, boycott, or civil disobedience. And the third method used to undermine systems of power is non-violent intervention, aimed to disrupt or deconstruct established institutions, beliefs, or policies. This includes non-violent obstruction or blockades, sit-ins, or fasting. If we fast forward about 80 years on from Gandhi's Salt March, non-violent action is still a very popular and powerful tactic of resistance against political regimes as well as other oppressive structures, rooted in unequal social and cultural conditions, like patriarchy, capitalism, or racial hierarchies. When 18-year-old Michael Brown, an unarmed black man from Ferguson in St. Louis, Missouri, was shot and killed by Darren Wilson, a white police officer, on the 9th of August 2014, the town erupted in mourning and anger, followed not long by the rest of the country, the world. His story spread like wildfire through the media and all over the internet, and it wasn't long before the whole world knew about Michael Brown and the serving of injustice that led to his death at the hands of the police officer.
It's been a day and night of protests in D.C.
The anger has not subsided at all. We have not received any justice.
The fight is no longer in Ferguson.
Protesters rallied outside the Justice Department calling for federal civil rights action against Officer Darren Wilson.
Don't shoot! Hey! Ho, ho! These are the cops they got!
The grand jury decided not to indict Darren Wilson, who shot Brown not once, but 6 times. He claimed his actions were in self-defense. Following the incident, through to after the jury's announcement of their decision not to indict the police officer, protesters took to the streets across the country. The shooting was an undoubted tragedy, but a recurring narrative in America's history. On Black Friday, around 150 demonstrators staged a massive lie-in, or die-in, at Chesterfield Mall in Missouri, shutting down business operations. And similar strategies of action were taken in the St. Louis area, where protesters boycotted retail stores Walmart and Target, while others took to the streets in DC, blocking off traffic on major roads for hours. In an article written for the Negotiation Journal of 2008, Finnegan and Hackley discussed nonviolent action as a negotiation strategy employed to engage and interact constructively with conflict. In places where the impact of dictatorship, terrorism, and war are so devastating, nonviolent action may seem ineffective against the forces, but there are many positive effects of nonviolent action if the right approach is taken. One element is the framing techniques used by the activists to gain media attention, build support from external audiences, and influence others to assist efforts. Symbolism is also mentioned as a critical element of nonviolent action. In both the cases of Gandhi's Salt March and the die-in protests in DC and Missouri that followed the grand jury's decision on Darren Wilson's case, symbolic references to their respective causes strengthened the meaning and purpose of their protest and promoted empathy, sparking widespread debate and conversation. Here is a quote taken from an article written for Time magazine on the accomplishments of the Ferguson protesters. They built a movement that revived a dormant national conversation about race and justice. Protest is a performance that can make the unseen visible. The most obvious distinction between images of Gandhi's Salt March and the protests in the US following the shooting of Michael Brown is the role technology played in the spread and reach of their message. In the latter case, not only did it help activists to communicate and organize to gather in larger numbers, protesters were able to upload live content from the boycotts, the marches, the sit-ins, onto social media sites like Twitter and rally support against police brutality across the globe. It was interesting to see that the images from the non-violent protest grew into something bigger than the actual events themselves could ever be. Globally trending hashtags Black Lives Matter, I Am Mike Brown, and Don't Shoot, with images and videos of the protests, took over social media, essentially starting a revolution online.
Traditional news networks on the ground in Ferguson have been able to provide some critical information to the public, but it's social media that's taken a front seat in both getting the information out and helping to organize the resistance of the protesters and demonstrators. In the aftermath of Brown's shooting, we've seen everything from witnesses to citizen journalists to world observers taking to social media in order to find and share the story.
Research on the future of nonviolent action and its interaction with the online sphere at this time is limited, as we are only now in an age realizing the power it has to create change and connect people. But through looking at the examples of nonviolent action from the past through to more recent times, we can see that it can be a far more valuable and constructive tactic than retaliation and violence. As Gandhi himself said, nonviolence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. It is mightier than the mightiest weapons of destruction devised by the ingenuity of man. It will be interesting to see how we experiment with new technologies in peaceful protesting as we evolve into this new age.